You look out the window today, right? And it just feels like the world is spinning completely off its axis.
Oh, absolutely. It feels very unprecedented.
Yeah. I mean, you have artificial intelligence threatening to wipe out entire job sectors literally overnight.
Right.
You've got global superpowers locked in these terrifying new standoffs and, inflation, national debts reaching numbers that just feel entirely disconnected from reality.
They look like typos on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. And we tell ourselves that we are living through this unique, unprecedented era. We assume this level of technological whiplash and economic anxiety is just a special feature of our time.
It's a very comforting illusion,
Right.
Believing our problems are brand new makes us feel, special. But the truth is actually much darker. We are essentially running a modern software update on a very old, deeply flawed operating system.
And that right there is the core of our deep dive today. We are looking at a very specific 15-year window of history, specifically 1815 to 1830.
A massively consequential 15 years.
We're pulling from an incredible stack of historical data, all centered around Paul Johnson's massive work, The Birth of the Modern. And our mission for you, the listener, is to trace the hidden roots of our current global anxiety.
Because the exact script we are living out right now.
Oh.
I mean, the financial meltdowns, the shifting populations, the technological displacement, all of it was written 2 centuries ago.
It's basically a historical pressure cooker.
Exactly. The end of the Napoleonic Wars triggered this chain reaction that built the entire infrastructure of the modern world. And the forces unleashed during those 15 years, they are still actively shaping your life today.
So we're going to strip away the academic jargon, no dry dates, no dusty textbook summaries. We are getting into the actual mechanics of how this happened.
The real gritty details.
Right. How the first global financial crash was engineered, how governments manufactured demographic explosions. And we're going to start in, honestly, the most brutal place imaginable.
The freezing, muddy ditch in Louisiana.
Yeah, where thousands of men were slaughtered for absolutely nothing.
January 8th, 1815. The Battle of New Orleans.
Let's set the physical scene for a second. It's dawn, the mist is thick, the British army is advancing, and they are just walking into a meat grinder.
Total devastation.
Thousands of casualties in close quarters, savage combat. But the sheer tragedy of this violence isn't just the death toll, right? It's the timing.
Right, because the war was already over.
Which is mind-blowing.
The governments of the United States and Great Britain had actually signed the Treaty of Ghent weeks earlier, on Christmas Eve, 1814.
This breaks my brain. You have thousands of soldiers tearing each other apart in the mud, completely unaware that their bosses had already shaken hands across the ocean. I mean, how does a massive military machine just fail to turn off?
Well, we suffer from severe chronological snobbery today.
What do you mean?
We just assume information has always moved faster than human action. But in 1815, human communication was entirely captive to the weather.
Oh, wow.
Information moved at the exact speed of the wind.
So, the treaty is signed in Belgium. But to stop the bullets in Louisiana, that piece of paper has to physically cross the Atlantic Ocean on a wooden sailing ship.
Precisely. And a transatlantic crossing took over 40 days.
Jeez.
The fastest presidential dispatch of that entire era clocked in at 41 days. There was simply no physical mechanism to warn the armies in time. So General Pakenham, the British commander, led his men into a frontal assault on entrenched American positions.
And the Americans, under Andrew Jackson, they had built these massive defensive ramparts out of mud and cotton bales, right?
Yes, and the British lines were just decimated.
The sources mention a detail about General Pakenham that is really hard to shake. He is killed in this completely pointless assault. Yeah. And his body isn't given some grand military funeral on the field.
No, it doesn't.
He is literally shoved into a barrel of rum to be pickled and then shipped back to England.
I mean, it was standard practice for preserving the bodies of high-ranking officers during long sea voyages, but it perfectly encapsulates the grim absurdity of the situation.
It really does.
A top-tier general, preserved in alcohol, sent home from a war that technically didn't exist anymore.
And let's look at the treaty itself, because it makes the violence even more insulting. They didn't fight to some bitter, decisive conclusion. They just quit.
Right. They agreed to a status quo antebellum.
Which is?
It's a polite diplomatic term for pretending the war never happened.
Wait, really? They just hit the reset button? All the massive issues they fought over the trade embargoes, the impressment of sailors, the borders, they just dropped them?
Every single one. And the mechanics of why they dropped them is crucial.
Okay.
The British didn't agree to peace because they were defeated in America.
Mm-hmm.
They agreed to peace because they were financially bleeding to death back in Europe.
Right, the numbers in the source material for this are staggering. The British government was spending 70% of its entire revenue just to service war debt.
70%.
Not to fight, just to pay the interest on the money they borrowed to fight.
Exactly. They had been the financial engine of the entire global coalition against Napoleon. They subsidized the armies of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. By 1814, the British treasury was just exhausted.
So they looked at America and gave up.
They looked at the conflict in America, which was basically a war over frontier borders and maritime rights, and realized it was a luxury they could no longer afford.
And the Americans weren't in a much better position, were they? I mean, their peace delegation sounded like a complete nightmare.
Oh, the American government was functionally bankrupt. The British had recently burned Washington, D.C. to the ground, and the American delegation in Ghent was deeply divided.
You had John Quincy Adams, right?
Yes, a very rigid New England aristocrat trapped in a room with Henry Clay, a fiery populist from the West.
And they hated each other.
They argued constantly over which concessions to make. Ultimately, both nations were so crippled by the cost of conflict that they just walked away without resolving a single underlying issue.
So they basically freeze the map in America, but over in Europe, the map is being violently redrawn.
Yes, it is.
And the way they did it was incredibly sinister. Which brings us to the Congress of Vienna.
Right. The victors of the Napoleonic Wars gathered in Vienna to divide the spoils. Now, it is often framed in history books as this grand, elegant affair.
Yeah, the elites waltzing while they literally wiped entire countries out of existence.
Exactly.
But the contrast in the city itself was horrifying. You have the royalty drinking champagne, and literally right outside their windows, the local population is starving to death.
Vienna in 1815 was a pauper city. The Austrian economy was in ruins after years of war. The currency had collapsed entirely.
And what were the people eating?
Well, to keep the poor from rioting in the streets, the authorities were feeding them something called Rumford soup.
I want to pause on Rumford soup for a second because the notes on this are fascinating. This wasn't some hearty, comforting stew. It was early, brutal nutritional science applied to poverty.
Count Rumford, the inventor, was actually a physicist. He approached human starvation as a mathematical problem. He wanted to know, how do you keep a human machine operating on the absolute minimum amount of calories and cost?
It's so cold.
It was a hyper-cheap paste, basically. Pearl barley, dried peas, potatoes, and sour beer. It was designed purely to prevent death, not to provide any comfort.
And while the citizens are eating this survival paste, the city is flooded with 215 princely families. Emperors, kings, dukes. The influx of diplomats drove housing rents in Vienna higher than in London.
The wealth disparity was staggering, but the true horror of the Congress of Vienna wasn't the parties. It was the bureaucracy.
Okay.
They created an institution called the Statistical Committee.
Which sounds like a boring accounting department. What did they actually do?
Their sole function was to manage the mathematical exchange of human beings.
Wow.
The great powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, they were redrawing the borders of Europe. But they didn't care about culture or shared history or language. They only cared about souls.
Meaning literal human bodies.
Yes. The Prussian representative, a diplomat named Hardenberg, insisted that all souls were equal.
Again, that sounds progressive to a modern ear, but in context, it's terrifying. He wasn't talking about human rights. He was talking about unit economics.
Precisely. He meant that a human being from Poland possessed the exact same geopolitical value as a human being from Germany. They were fungible assets.
Like trading cards.
Yes. If the new security map required Austria to absorb 1 million Polish citizens, Prussia demanded 1 million German citizens from another region just to balance the spreadsheet.
So you have these diplomats sitting in a lavish room trading 10,000 Polish farmers for 10,000 Italian merchants, just moving them across a ledger. It's treating nations like poker chips. How did anyone justify this at the time? I mean, wiping ancient states like Saxony off the map entirely?
Well, there was massive pushback. In the British Parliament, Foreign Secretary Castlereagh was viciously attacked for being complicit in this. Critics accused him of handing independent republics over to despotic monarchies.
And his defense is one of the coldest statements of the era. He flat out admitted it.
Castlereagh told Parliament that the Congress was not assembled for moral principles. It was assembled for great practical purposes.
General security?
Exactly. The goal was general security.
Right.
They needed buffer states. They needed massive artificial empires to block future aggression. They built a big Austria to stop Russian expansion into the Balkans. They built a big Prussia to keep France in check.
The map of Europe was treated as a structural engineering problem. They used human populations as the mortar to build walls against future wars.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But armies cost money. Drawing a new map doesn't pay off 15 years of war debt. And this is where the era connects so violently with our own anxieties today about inflation and taxation. The bill came due, and the governments decided to squeeze it out of the citizens.
The post-war tax burden was unprecedented in human history. To pay down the massive national debts, governments began taxing the absolute minutiae of daily life.
The source provides this incredible, visceral quote from Sidney Smith, a writer at the time. It really paints a picture of inescapable government extortion.
It does.
He wrote about a system where literally everything was taxed. The sauce on your food, the medicine that heals you. He said there were taxes on the ermine that decorates the judge and the rope that hangs the criminal. Taxes on the brass nails of a coffin and the ribbons on a bride's dress.
As Smith wrote, the schoolboy whips his taxed horse. The beardless youth manages his taxed horse with a taxed bridle on a taxed road.
The state had monetized every single aspect of existence.
They really had, but the timing was just catastrophic, because just as taxes peaked, the economy fell off a cliff.
Right.
During the war, agricultural prices were sky high because armies needed feeding. Once peace broke out, demand vanished.
The bottom fell out of the agricultural market. The price of wheat plummeted from 134 shillings to 52 shillings.
That is massive economic whiplash. Farmers who had taken on debt to expand their fields during the boom years were suddenly ruined. Even wealthy landowners couldn't collect rent.
And then you have the final apocalyptic blow. The weather turned against them. 1816 became known as the year without a summer.
Yes. The climatic anomalies were extreme.
Imagine struggling to pay the tax on your child's toys. Your income has been slashed in half, and then in July, it starts snowing.
Torrential rains, sleet, and freezing temperatures persisted throughout the summer months across Europe. Harvests failed completely.
And the mechanics of this are terrifying. When a harvest fails in a pre-industrial society, you don't just see higher prices at the grocery store, you see immediate widespread starvation.
The countryside literally emptied out. Roads were filled with ragged, desperate people wandering in search of food. And this intense misery collided with a deeply counterintuitive demographic trend.
Right, this is the face-slapping part.
Despite the famine, despite the poverty, Europe's population was exploding.
Which makes no sense on the surface. You have awful weather, terrible economies, and high taxes. You would think the population would shrink, but it became this massive pressure cooker.
The population surge was driven by a mystery that demographers actually still debate. Between 1750 and 1900, the population of Europe more than doubled, jumping from roughly 150 million to over 400 million.
They weren't having more babies. People were just refusing to die.
Exactly. The birth rates remained high, but the death rates, particularly infant mortality, began to decline significantly faster.
Why?
Better basic sanitation, slight improvements in urban planning, the gradual fading of certain pandemic strains. The result was millions of additional bodies competing for a shrinking pool of resources.
It's the soda bottle analogy. You shake up a bottle of carbonated water, the pressure builds, the taxes, the famine, the lack of land, the people had to burst out somewhere.
And that combination of demographic pressure and sudden widespread poverty sparked the first massive wave of modern global migration.
Between 1815 and 1840, over 1 million people fled Britain and Ireland alone. They looked at a continent that was squeezing them to death, and they looked across the ocean.
They needed cheap land. They needed a place where the tax collector couldn't reach them.
But here's the brutal reality of this escape. The empty wilderness they were dreaming of wasn't empty.
No, it wasn't.
And the greatest real estate boom in human history became an apocalyptic event for the people who already lived there.
We're talking about systematic native clearance on a global scale.
The governments of the world realized that to absorb these desperate migrants, they needed to manufacture vacant land.
In Russia, the Tsar simply handed over 120 million acres of ancestral tribal lands to settlers and military veterans.
Just gave it away.
These were vast pastoral hunting grounds converted overnight into agricultural settlements.
And in the Americas, the process was completely industrialized. The United States government pushed indigenous populations past the Mississippi River. They seized 190 million acres of native land.
And the financial compensation was an absolute insult. The U.S. paid a total of roughly $70 million in gifts and annuities for 190 million acres. It was theft facilitated by military threat.
But the sources point out that South America, particularly Argentina, saw some of the most concentrated brutality.
Yes. Argentina possessed vast pampas, incredibly fertile plains, similar to the North American Midwest. Once the Spanish Empire collapsed, the new settler governments realized the global market was desperate for hides and salted meat to feed the booming European populations.
The land was immensely valuable, but only if it was cleared of the people who lived on it.
So they launched military campaigns of extermination. Generals built their entire political careers on becoming hammers of the Indians. The source specifically notes General Rosas, who was called the Caligula of the Rio Plata.
Oh.
He led relentless massacres to secure the plains for European cattle ranches.
And the economic incentive is laid out in stark math in the book. Once the indigenous populations were removed, land prices in Argentina skyrocketed. They went from 0.11 gold pesos per square kilometer to 2.00 gold pesos.
That is a 2,000% increase in land value, directly tied to the elimination of native tribes.
But the clearance wasn't just achieved with guns and cavalry, right? There was an ecological horror happening at the exact same time. The vanguard of the European invasion wasn't always soldiers, it was farm animals.
Ecological imperialism. It is a fascinating and terrifying mechanism of conquest. Europeans introduced their domestic livestock, pigs, cows, horses.
Right?
In the vast, unfenced environments of the Americas, these animals ran feral.
I mean, how does a feral pig destroy a civilization?
By outcompeting native species and fundamentally altering the flora. Feral pigs are highly aggressive foragers. They root up native plants, destroy agricultural plots maintained by indigenous tribes, and consume the food sources that native game relies on.
So they destroy the food supply.
Exactly. In Argentina, massive herds of millions of wild horses preceded the actual human settlers. They ate the vegetation down to the dirt, transforming the ecosystem before a single colonist even arrived.
The weeds and the livestock conquered the land first, and then came the invisible killer.
Biological warfare, largely unintentional, but devastatingly effective. European diseases like smallpox swept through indigenous populations that had zero genetic immunity.
There was an indigenous legend mentioned in the texts of the smallpox rider, a phantom that traveled ahead of the white settlers, visiting villages and leaving nothing but corpses.
The physical reality was just as grim. Entire communities were erased by pathogens weeks before they ever saw a European soldier.
And when the soldiers did arrive, the coldness of their mission is hard to process. Charles Darwin was actually traveling through Argentina in 1831 on the Beagle, right at the end of this 15-year window. He witnessed the aftermath of these military clearances.
Darwin's observations really capture the stark, genocidal logic of the era.
He noted that the soldiers were slaughtering young Indian men, which is the grim reality of war, but he was shocked to see that they were systematically murdering the older women in cold blood as well.
Yeah.
He actually asked a local gaucho why they were doing this, and the gaucho's response was, "Why? What can be done? They breed so."
It is the reduction of human beings to a pest control problem. The sheer corporate and military efficiency of this global land grab is staggering. Millions of Europeans pushed out by debt and demographics, violently replacing the civilizations that stood in their way.
And what's wild is how that displacement ties into the transportation revolution. I mean, getting all those settlers and their goods across this huge, newly emptied land. Look at the Mississippi River.
Oh, the steamboat revolution is a perfect example. Before steam, moving cargo upriver was almost impossible. But suddenly you have this new technology.
The numbers in the source are wild. Steamboats on the Mississippi went from like 31 ships in 1819 to nearly 400 by 1830.
And the economic impact of that speed was instantaneous. The freight costs from New Orleans up to Louisville plummeted.
From $5 per 100 pounds to 25 cents.
It's a complete collapse in shipping costs, which only accelerated the demand for more land and therefore more clearance.
It's all connected. It's a total demographic replacement fueled by new tech. But while we're talking about demographics, we have to look at another captive population during this exact same window. We just saw indigenous numbers plummet, but there was another enslaved population whose numbers went in the exact opposite, equally horrifying direction.
The enslaved populations in the United States.
This is a terrifying fact of history. Everyone assumes technology frees people, right? But the legal importation of slaves into the U.S. from Africa ended in 1808. You would assume the population would stagnate or decline. Instead, it exploded.
It skyrocketed. In 1810, the enslaved population in the U.S. was roughly 1.1 million. By 1860, it had surged to almost 4 million.
A four-fold increase. Without legal importation, smuggling was minimal, maybe 15,000 a year. So how does a captive population quadruple?
Through a carefully managed industrialized breeding program, the United States became the only slave society in the Western world to develop a high growth rate purely through natural increase.
It's sickening.
They achieved an astounding 2% annual growth rate.
The source material uses a phrase to explain this that makes my skin crawl. It attributes this rapid population growth to good material conditions.
It is a deeply uncomfortable economic reality.
We usually associate good material conditions with human progress. We think of health, nutrition, and safety as the hallmarks of a free, thriving society. But here, health and nutrition were weaponized.
The plantation owners recognized a shift in their economic model. With the transatlantic trade closed, their existing enslaved workforce became a highly constrained, incredibly valuable capital asset.
Right.
Their greatest source of future wealth wasn't just the cotton being picked, it was the natural reproduction of the people picking it.
They managed human beings like high-yield livestock.
Precisely. They provided just enough physical sustenance, just enough medical care, driven entirely by the twisted logic of property management to ensure low death rates and incredibly high birth rates.
The birth rate among enslaved people hit over 50 per 1,000.
Because the global economy demanded it. The Industrial Revolution in Britain was creating an insatiable appetite for raw cotton. And new technology, like the cotton gin, didn't reduce the need for labor, it amplified it.
The cotton gin is the ultimate technological betrayal. It removed the bottleneck of separating the seeds from the fiber. Suddenly, you could process cotton 50 times faster.
Which meant you needed 50 times more cotton planted and picked to feed the machine. Technology didn't liberate the enslaved, it locked them into a highly efficient, industrialized system of forced reproduction.
And meanwhile, Britain is enforcing this new global order with an iron fist, right?
Yes, the geopolitics of the British Empire were essentially built on sea power. They didn't have a massive standing army to control the globe.
So how do they do it?
They controlled the choke points, Malta, Cape Town, Singapore. They acted as the world's policemen, entirely through naval supremacy.
Like the bombardment of Algiers in 1816.
Exactly. The British and Dutch sent a fleet to bombard Algiers to force an end to Christian slavery and piracy in the Mediterranean. It was a brutal display of Western technological and military dominance.
They just leveled the city to make a point.
To assert absolute control over global trade routes. Because all that raw material, the cotton from America, the markets in South America, it all fed back into the British industrial machine.
And the fuel for that machine was coal, which brings up another horrifying cost of this era.
Coal mines, yes.
The sources outline how the demand for coal led to deeper, more dangerous mines. And that led to massive tragedies, like the Felling mine disaster in 1812.
92 miners and child laborers were killed in a massive gas explosion.
92 people, including kids.
Because, as they dug deeper to feed the Industrial Revolution, they hit pockets of methane gas. One spark from a miner's candle and the entire shaft would detonate.
But this disaster actually forced a massive technological breakthrough, didn't it?
It did. The public outcry was so intense that they brought in Sir Humphrey Davy, a brilliant scientist, to solve the problem. He invented the Davy safety lamp, which encased the flame in a fine metal mesh.
So the gas could enter the lamp and burn, giving a warning, but the flame couldn't pass through the mesh to ignite the whole mine.
Exactly. It saved countless lives, but it's a perfect example of how industrial safety regulations and technologies are almost always written in blood.
Speaking of brilliant scientists, there was another guy during this 15-year window who was so far ahead of his time, it is almost unbelievable.
Ah, Charles Babbage.
Yes. In the middle of the steam age, this guy invents a computer.
The difference engine. It is one of the great historical tragedies of technology. Babbage designed a massive mechanical calculating machine using complex algebraic equations and thousands of gears.
He wanted to automate the calculation of mathematical tables because humans kept making mistakes. The source mentions human calculation tables had like 500 typesetting errors in them.
Exactly. Babbage's machine was designed to calculate and automatically print the results, eliminating human error entirely. It was a modern computer architecture.
So why didn't it change the world in the 1820s?
Because the world wasn't ready for him. He spent tens of thousands of pounds, his own money, and government grants. But the manufacturing technology of the 1820s just wasn't precise enough.
They didn't have the materials.
Right. They lacked light alloys and precision machine tools. You can't build a computer out of crude, heavy cast iron and brass. He was a century too early.
That is so incredibly frustrating. But it's funny, Babbage was this highly educated genius who failed, while the real world-changing tech was coming from guys at the absolute bottom of society.
The democratization of invention.
Yeah, the sources make this massive point that places like Oxford and Cambridge contributed basically zero to the Industrial Revolution.
They were busy studying Greek and Latin.
Exactly. The guys who actually built the modern world were completely uneducated. Look at George Stephenson, the father of the railways.
He started out as a cowherd. He couldn't even read until he was 18.
And James Naismith, who invented the steam hammer, he just built his own tools in his bedroom.
It was an era of free trade inability. The old academic monopolies were broken by practical men working with their hands.
And they were building some crazy stuff. Okay, we all know about steam trains, but the source material casually drops the fact that they had steam cars on the public roads in the 1820s.
Yes. Gurney steam carriages.
This is wild. Why didn't we have a car century in the 1800s?
Because of corporate lobbying.
Seriously.
Gurney steam carriages were hitting speeds of 15 miles per hour on the roads in 1829. They were reliable, carrying passengers. But they threatened two massive power blocks: the horse-drawn carriage industry and the new railway magnates.
So what did they do?
They went to Parliament. They passed discriminatory toll acts. They basically taxed the steam cars off the roads by charging them exorbitant toll fees compared to horse-drawn vehicles.
They literally legislated the automobile out of existence for 100 years to protect their monopolies.
They absolutely did. It's a stark reminder that superior technology doesn't always win if the entrenched interests are strong enough.
Wow. But there was one technology they couldn't stop, and it totally reshaped society: the printing press.
The democratization of knowledge.
Books used to be this insane luxury item. But after 1815, book prices in France and Britain just collapsed.
They fell by 50%. In France, 3-franc books flooded the market.
And newspapers went absolutely crazy.
The game changer there was the steam-powered rotary press. The Times in London secretly installed one in 1814. Suddenly they could print thousands of copies an hour.
And the working class started reading. The source mentions the penny magazine selling 200,000 copies.
The knowledge was no longer hoarded by the elite. The masses could afford to read, to learn, and to organize.
And when the masses organize, politics fundamentally changes. Look at what happened in America just a few years later: the Jacksonian Revolution.
The birth of mass American democracy.
The voting numbers here are a massive slap in the face to the old elites. In the 1824 U.S. election, you had maybe 300,000 voters. By the 1828 election, over 1.1 million people voted.
And Andrew Jackson rode that populist wave, crushing the old establishment with over 640,000 popular votes.
The elites were horrified.
They were. And you saw a very similar explosion of mass politics across the ocean in Ireland, led by Daniel O'Connell.
Right, he was an Irish Catholic lawyer, and he essentially invented the modern, peaceful mass movement.
He mobilized millions of poor, disenfranchised Irish Catholics to demand political rights from the British Empire.
And he did it with the Catholic rent, right, a penny a month.
Yes. By asking for just a penny, he allowed the poorest peasant to become a stakeholder in a massive political organization. It was a brilliant structural innovation.
He built a network so powerful that it forced the British Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, the guy who beat Napoleon, to back down and pass the Catholic Emancipation Act.
Power was shifting from the aristocrats to the crowd.
But the elites were still trying to figure out what to do with all their money. Because all this growth, the cotton mills, the new mass markets, the cheap transport, it created vast amounts of wealth. And what do humans do when they suddenly have too much capital?
They invent spectacularly complex ways to lose it.
Right. 200 years ago, bankers invented phantom debts to trick investors, triggering a global financial meltdown that looks exactly like the crashes we see today.
The first modern financial crash.
Let's get into this because it's so relevant. By the early 1820s, the economic gloom had lifted. Middle-class savers in London and Paris merchants, clerks, minor nobility suddenly found themselves flush with cash.
But the domestic markets were saturated. Government bonds in Britain were offering very low interest rates, so investors started looking abroad for the next big opportunity.
The ultimate emerging market, Latin America.
The Spanish Empire in the Americas was disintegrating. New republics were declaring independence left and right: Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile.
But to understand why Latin America was suddenly open for business, we have to look at how Spain lost it. And again, it comes down to incredibly bad financial mechanics by a government. The source details how the Spanish government essentially detonated its own colonial economy.
During the wars against Napoleon, Spain was desperate for cash. So they demanded a forced loan of 40 million pesos from their Latin American territories.
How do you enforce a forced loan on a colonial elite? I mean, most of these wealthy landowners didn't have vaults full of gold. Their wealth was tied up in their estates.
That was the fatal error. The landowners were heavily mortgaged. They couldn't pay the forced loan. So the Spanish government, in an act of breathtaking ineptitude, forced the sale of these agricultural estates at public auction to extract the cash.
They bankrupted their own loyalist elites. They destroyed the economic foundation of their own colonies.
It triggered massive resentment. The local leaders realized the imperial center was a parasite that would destroy them to save itself. This forced loan was a massive catalyst for the independence movements.
So Spain gets kicked out. The new republics are formed. But they have no money, no infrastructure, and barely functioning governments. They need capital.
And London bankers were more than happy to provide it. Major financial houses like Barclays and the Goldschmidts stepped in as middlemen.
How does this work mechanically in the 1820s?
The banks would negotiate a loan with an agent of a new republic, say £1 million for Colombia. The bank would then issue bonds to the British public to raise that money.
Right.
The bank takes a massive commission up front. The republic gets the cash to build its army or infrastructure, and the British investor gets a piece of paper promising a high interest rate, usually around 6%.
It sounds exactly like 19th century crypto or the subprime mortgage crisis. You have ordinary people, small savers in London, pouring their life savings into bonds for countries they couldn't even point to on a map.
Oh, it was pure speculation. The investors didn't care about the economic viability of Peru or Chile. They just saw the high yield. The London banks floated over £20 million in these loans.
And the banks didn't care either, because they got their commission the moment the bond was sold. It is unchecked speculation fueled by easy credit, and, as always, the music stops.
The bubble burst in 1825, what became known as Black December.
What was the trigger? Did the countries just default?
The realization finally set in that these new republics simply didn't have the tax infrastructure or the export economies to make the interest payments. The flow of silver from the American mines had dried up during the Wars of Independence.
And the moment one payment is missed, the panic sets in.
It was a brutal domino effect. The London banks that had underwritten these loans collapsed under the weight of the bad debt. Barclays closed its doors in 1826, which actually caused the Mexican government to lose £300,000 that were sitting in their accounts.
Wow.
The mighty Goldschmidt family bank collapsed, which forced the government of Peru into default.
So the investors who bought the bonds, what happened to them?
They lost everything. By mid-1827, all but one of the newly independent Latin American countries had defaulted on their debts. The bonds became worthless pieces of paper.
And no one was immune. The sources talk about how even absolute geniuses got wiped out in this crash.
Yes, the blast radius was huge.
Look at Sir Walter Scott. He was the most famous best-selling author in the world at the time.
He was.
And he got caught up in the collapse of his publisher. He was left with a personal debt of £46,000. That's a staggering fortune.
And William Congreve, the guy who invented modern military rockets, he invested heavily in these speculative schemes, went bankrupt, and died in poverty.
It triggered a massive continent-wide depression. Credit completely froze. In France, the luxury silk trade collapsed because nobody was buying. The cotton mills in Britain suffered massive layoffs.
And just to add to the misery, bad harvests threatened famine once again.
It is the exact cycle of modern global capitalism. The debt from the Napoleonic Wars forces a geopolitical peace. The peace allows populations to explode and move to new frontiers. The new markets create a massive surplus of wealth. And that wealth seeks high yields, leading to insane speculation, which inevitably results in a catastrophic crash. Boom and bust, engineered right there in the 1820s.
It is the matrix of the modern world. The systems of international finance, demographic engineering, mass media, and geopolitical map drawing, all of it locked into place during this brief window.
It is genuinely unsettling how familiar it all is. We started in the frozen, muddy battlefield of New Orleans, looking at men who died simply because information couldn't cross an ocean fast enough.
Right.
We moved into the velvet-lined ballrooms of Vienna, where diplomats treated human populations like entries on a spreadsheet.
Fungible assets.
We witnessed the brutal efficiency of the global land grab, where economics and disease wiped out entire civilizations to make room for cattle. We examined the horrifying, calculated explosion of the enslaved population, managed like an agricultural asset.
Fueled by the cotton gin.
And finally, the crashing stock markets of London, where phantom wealth evaporated overnight and took the real economy and some of the era's brightest minds down with it.
all of it contained within 15 years. Paul Johnson's central thesis really holds up. The blueprint for modernity is heavily stained with unintended consequences and calculated cruelty.
And he makes a point that I really haven't been able to stop thinking about. He argues that every generation has to learn the risks of bad investments and bad geopolitics anew. We never seem to learn the lesson permanently. We just assume our new technology makes us immune to the old mistakes.
We change the costumes, we speed up the communication, but the underlying mechanics of human greed, panic, and power, they remain entirely static.
Which brings me to the thought I want to leave you with today. If the years between 1815 and 1830 wrote the script for the modern world, a script defined by rapid technological adoption, crippling national debt, shifting demographics, and exploding new markets, take a hard look out your window right now.
Look at the headlines.
Exactly. Look at the headlines. We have massive, unprecedented global migrations. We have disruptive AI technology that is threatening to rewrite the value of human labor. We have rising, staggering national debts that governments are struggling to service. Are we currently living through another 15-year window?
That's a terrifying question.
A window that is quietly, violently rewriting the rules of the world for the next 2 centuries, while we are all just distracted by the daily noise. The people fighting in the mud of New Orleans didn't know the war was over. The investors buying Latin American bonds didn't know the vaults were empty. What fundamental reality of our world has already shifted while we are still waiting for the message to arrive?